Okay, let's look now at some of the featured herbs in our UTI section. We've talked about these before. Some of these we also saw in kidney stones, but we're going to highlight a few that we haven't seen. And of course, we're going to take a look at a couple of the pictures so they can get a bit of an idea of what these look like. Let's start with Arctostaphylos. Sometimes this is just called uva ursi. In fact, most of the time you'll remember uva ursi as the main common name. Bearberry, of course, is more common, or its actual common name, but uva ursi is usually what you'll hear. Sometimes it's called arcto as well. People often then, in the beginning, get this mixed up with arctium and burdock, but this is our bearberry. Obviously, urinary antimicrobial, to some degree diuretic, and pretty good astringent as well. We talked about overlapping our mechanisms of action before, and this is where we've got hydroquinones, which make it distinctly different from some of the other herbs that we use that have volatile oils in them. Also some tannins. I didn't mention that above, but that's useful as well because, of course, tannins equals astringent, and astringent is always a useful action to include in antimicrobial formula. It's not directly antimicrobial in the way that some of the volatile oils are, but that astringency at least helps weaken the bacteria. In particular, that's one of the mechanisms of action that are included here. So we use this, obviously, UTIs, to a lesser degree kidney stones, but you'll see it, and then obviously something that's more significant. You will see it in BPH. I would say not so much in BPH. I don't think it's that good, but you will still see it there. I think mostly because of its astringent action, but I think we will do a later video specifically on BPH, and we'll mention our Arcto uva ursi again. However, I usually leave it out in favor of some stronger herbs that also are more astringing and drying and a little more toning in particular. This is a fairly safe herb to use. There's probably some toxicity. We don't know. We don't use it in pregnancy. Here's what you really want to remember about this herb, and this seems to be true in the research. This seems to be actually quite accurate. The arbutin, which is our main constituent, is less well converted. It doesn't mean it's not converted. It's just less well converted in acidic urine. Sometimes in UTIs, people are given urinary acidifiers. If that's the case, your bearberry becomes less well selected as a choice. If you have the ability to, which is not that hard to do at all, run a quick dipstick and get a pH, and you do find that the urine is acidic, then this herb is more basic, then this herb becomes a better choice. Okay, so here's our bearberry here, and this is pretty much what it looks like. It's pretty common. That's a nice picture of it there. It's pretty common to see it grow low bushes and shrubs, often on rocks. It's a pretty hardy plant. You will see this in wild. I've definitely seen this out in the wilderness. Let's actually go back here for a second, and it's the leaf that we use. I don't know if you can use the berry. I don't remember if the berry is edible or if it's medicinal, but most of the time it's the leaf that we use. And this is a pretty robust and a pretty hardy herb, so it's actually pretty easy to get a fair amount of this. So that's our bearberry there. I don't know, that's a good picture of it there. I don't know if there's too much else we want to show. Yeah, so you can see in some places it really grows to a fine mat. These would be unripe berries. I don't know that matters when we harvest the leaves, how the state of the berries is, but that's usually what it looks like when we see it, at least in the wild. Okay. So let's look at our next herb here, and that is going to be juniper. We've talked about this one quite a bit in this section, and the reason for that is I think this is our main urinary antimicrobial. You'll see it in a few other places. Flatulence, not quite sure why I included that when I put these notes together. I must have found in some source that as a traditional use. I almost exclusively use it for UTIs. I rarely use it much outside of that, but I do think of it as really the primary UTI antimicrobial, as we've talked about. We've also talked about this. May cause renal damage with prolonged use, contraindicated in kidney disease, renal failure, definitely. Anything that is a strong antimicrobial is going to be contraindicated, especially in pregnancy, usually also in lactation. We'll see that with sage in a minute. That one's actually got a specific contraindication. But any strong antimicrobials, don't use antimicrobials in pregnancy. Just don't do it. There's really rarely a need to do it, and if you want to do it, then there are some other things to look at. We will in another section look at some of that, but for the most part, just don't do that. Don't use those. And that, here's another piece that we might want to talk about, and it's that it is warming. It's fairly stimulating, and we do use these more if you've got, sneaking a little TCM into our notes here, but more in cool deficient patterns. So that's going to be clear, white, often cloudy urination, and often more where we see a pattern of recurrent. Now, a lot of UTIs are going to be damp heat, but if you remember our TCM integration, we talked about that cold or deficiency pattern as well. Juniper, I think, is particularly good in deficiency patterns, but don't only think of it as that. I would suggest almost always, if you are directly treating a UTI, juniper should be on that list of herbs to use. Okay, let's go over and take a look at juniper. And you've probably seen this before. Nice herb, common herb, grows as a shrub, grows wild, shows up in a lot of ornamentals. It is indeed the berries we normally use. It's interesting. I haven't seen the leaves used much, but there's no reason you can't use the leaves. These would be the more ripe berries. These would be the less ripe or the immature berries. I believe the ripe berries are more potent, more commonly used. It grows, as you can see here, sometimes I don't know if that's a juniper. That's probably a special subtype of juniper. Usually we see it here, at least in Canada or southern Ontario, we see it as low-lying shrubs, something like this. So, and you'll see this in the wild. This definitely, if you go for a walk in the woods, you'll see patches. Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. You see little ones like that. Obviously, that's been planted in someone's garden. Let's go back up to some of these pictures here. I think these are all pretty good. This is probably the most realistic picture. These might be cultivated. That looks like a little more berry than I normally see in the wild. But let's see if we can pull this picture up specifically. And you can see it's an evergreen shrub and it's got these berries. You've certainly seen these. If you haven't gone for a walk in the woods, you've at least gone for a walk in the neighborhoods. You've seen these in people's gardens as well. So here's our juniper. Great herb, pretty easy to harvest the berries, pretty abundant, very hardy, grows very well. Nice herb to use, and a pretty key herb for treating UTIs. That is often paired with sage, and I think using the two together is good. Juniper is warm, sage is cool. If you want to make some differentiation there based on the pattern that you see, you can do that. I often just use both, though. I don't worry so much about hot or cold. Sometimes I set that aside a little bit. Maybe I'll favor one or the other, but I'll set that aside mostly and highlight that antimicrobial action. So we've got sage. A little more to say about sage. We use this one more broadly than we use juniper. Like I said, juniper doesn't mean you can't use it in other conditions. I've certainly used it in some upper respiratory tract infections, but mostly we do use juniper in UTIs. Sage we can use all over the place, probably more specific to upper respiratory tract infections. And then here's our UTIs right here, and even just general infections. Potent antimicrobial, that's true. Some affinity to the upper respiratory tract and the GU, I also do think that's true. And we've got diaphoretic. Anything with essential oils is going to be carminative to some degree, but we don't often. We have better carminatives than sage. You can use it though. And of course, we've got some astringency there as well. Generally considered safe, widely used in cooking, etc. So this has been around for a long time. However, it is a strong antimicrobial. Prolonged use will disrupt healthy gut flora, so I would say that. And long-term use may irritate, probably will irritate the kidneys. I'll come back to this in just a second. It contains thuone, as you will remember. Thuone is the same constituent we found in thuya, which we'll see together, and that should be a J. That's also found in wormwood, and this is a neurotoxin. This is why when people would drink absinthe, they would have those hallucinations. Now, you have to drink a significant amount of sage or thuya to get that. It's actually quite difficult to do, but not impossible, and it is a real contraindication. I don't know that you could hit this using regular amounts that we'd use here. I've certainly never heard of anyone starting to hallucinate when drinking sage tea or taking sage tincture. Much like absinthe, you didn't start hallucinating after your first little dose. You had to drink it, all night over periods of time to really get some of that. So I don't want to say that it's not a caution It is, but probably not one you have to worry about when you're using it medicinally. This part is definitely true, though. I put it in bold. Notably contraindicated in breastfeeding because sage is actually traditionally used, and I do believe effectively, to decrease breast milk when it's time, if someone needs to, for weaning. So don't use sage. It's one of the few herbs. Probably some of the other aromatics I'm also like. I probably don't use juniper or even rosemary that much in breastfeeding, but it's one of the few herbs that is notably contraindicated in breastfeeding. Breastfeeding has a much shorter list of true contraindications than pregnancy. Useful infections, high fever, heat symptoms. Yep, true. Probably useful to remember that sacred sage or smudging sage, different herb. You could use it as well, but those are going to be different herbs, and also, of course, different than the more truly Salvia divinorum, the more truly hallucinogenic herb that is sometimes smoked. So they're still salvias, but they're quite different in their action. So as you see here, pairs well with juniper for UTIs. You can pair it with, so this is clove, for pretty much any infection, particularly bacterial infections in this case. A good substitute would be rosemary. Let's go take a look at our sage. You've seen this one before. Yeah, these are all great pictures of sage here. Let's take a look at this one. Common sage, garden sage. And it has these nice, we use the leaf, has these nice leaves. These can grow fairly broad. That's a nice picture there too. They can grow fairly broad. Yeah, that's beautiful. And they're very aromatic. So, you reach down and you rub this leaf and you'll immediately, you'll smell those rich, heady essential oils. Really quite a potent herb. And a nice one. One that, again, grows pretty commonly. It has a broad array of actions, pretty hardy, pretty easy to harvest. Nice herb. This is definitely one you can grow easily in your garden. Once it's established, you can leave it out. Even if you go to our CC&M garden, there are a couple of sage plants, and they'll stay out all winter. They'll come back, and they'll act as they are perennials. And they don't grow during the winter, but they will. You can just leave them out there. You don't have to do any special care for them. Quite a nice herb. That is our sage. Okay. Let's look at the next herb in our featured herbs section. Solidago we already saw. I'm not going to go over Solidago again. I'll quickly show the picture. Looks like this. You remember goldenrod. If you want a refresher on this, just go back to our kidney stones and take a look at what we talked about there. But you've still got it in your notes as well. The next herb we're going to look at is going to be cedar. Let's review it, and then we'll take a look at it again. You probably know what this one looks like already. Cedar, same thing, potent antimicrobial. I like this one especially for viral infections. I don't know if I said that anywhere specifically, but that URTIs are, of course, mostly viral infections. I like this especially viral. But broad. Do I use it in bacterial infections? Obviously. And UTIs, yes, so I don't worry about that. Some traditional use as for a herb for incontinence. I can't really speak to that. I haven't used it for that. Some traditional use topical for warts. I also haven't seen great effects there. It's probably somewhat true, but it's not my go-to for warts. A few other things that I use and I feel work a little bit better. And obviously in homeopathy, it's the remedy for warts. That doesn't necessarily mean it works that way in terms of translating it back and forth, but sometimes it's used for that. Not recommended longer than 3 consecutive weeks. This one is strong. It does contain thuione. Obviously, with a name like Thuya, you would expect that. So some caution is warranted. How much do you really have to be careful? I don't use it for longer than a few weeks consecutively. You shouldn't need to use an antimicrobial herb for more than very special occasions maybe, but for more than a few weeks at a time. I don't think I can think of a case where I've ever used Thuya in a combo for more than 10 days at the outer limit. Generally reserved for difficult infections. Yep, that might be why you do use it for a little bit longer, but this isn't a herb. I'll include it in some upper respiratory tract infections for short term for sure, but it is a stronger herb, definitely. And here we've got some of the other herbs you can pair it with. Sage is a pretty good substitute. Let's take a look at our Thuya. Here it is. Cedar, often called white cedar or arbor vitae. There are a number of different cedars. This one does grow quite well here in southern Ontario, even if you go a little north of Toronto. Some really beautiful cedar trees. They're very hardy. They can grow. I've seen them. There's a place where they just grow pretty much right out of the cliffs. It's along the Bruce Trail. It's a pretty beautiful place. And they say that those cedar trees are hundreds of years old. They're not very big because they've really had to survive on very little, but they're still there. They're still thriving. Quite beautiful trees. And, Bruce Trail is a pretty nice spot. So we have a lot of cedar, especially, again, a little north of Toronto, because that gets us into a different climatic zone. And these are mostly ornamentals. I don't see any wild cedar trees, but there's a good picture of what it looks like anyway. You can use the ornamentals. Most of the time, those are the same species. There are a little bit of variations, of course, but if you have ornamental cedar bushes or trees in your yard, as long as you haven't sprayed them with anything, you're not near anywhere where it's going to be coated with a lot of pollutants, things like that, you can absolutely use that as your medicine. So that's cedar. It's a pretty unique evergreen. It's really got these flat leaves. It's a few different plants that have similar patterns of leaf, but fairly unique. Most things that we see, at least around here, if it looks like this, it probably is cedar. So that's our cedar. We mostly use the leaves. Some people will also include the berries. These are not fresh berries. These would be probably from the season before. So these are dried up. These have now gone to seed. But you can also use cedar berries. I don't know if we've got any pictures of those that I've seen on here, but that is our cedar. Couple more to take a look at. Nettle leaf we also saw, so I'm not going to go over that one again. And this one we know pretty well. Go back and take a look at it in our kidney stones formula. Nettle's a great herb. Nutritious as a food, makes a wilderness rope, excellent diuretic. I think even a bit. You've probably barely heard me use the word, I can't even remember it. So there's a specific word as a tonic when things are used to kind of restore. It's not really used that often as a word anymore, so much so that I can't remember it. I'll see if I can add it to the notes. Where tropho-restorative sometimes is what comes up. I don't know if that was quite the word I was looking for, but we don't really use that as a concept so much in botanical medicine anymore. But you will find that nettle is often thought of as a nutritive, something that's used to build people up. Let's carry on and look at old man's beard. Here's a pretty fun herb. This is actually not a herb. And yes, we mentioned earlier the organic acids, specifically the usnic acid and barbatic acid. I don't know that one nearly as well. Here it is. Usnea is a lichen. So it's not just a regular herb. A lichen is a symbiosis of fungi and algae. That is pretty interesting. It also makes it very unique. So when we do use it, it really almost always brings a novel mechanism of action to our formulas. This is a plant or a lichen that I actually really like quite a bit. And partly it is, I grew up in a coastal climate. I grew up on the East Coast, and this was all over the place. And even if we didn't know its common name was old man's beard, that's what we called it because it's what it looks like. You'll see a picture of it in a minute, but we would, as kids in the woods, we'd poke a little hole for our mouths and we'd hang it down and be like, look at me, I'm an old man. And, pretty good reason why it got that as its common name. It also has a bit of a history of use as a topical antiseptic and as a styptic. So I think amongst us kids growing up in the woods, we kind of knew, okay, if you get a cut, this is one of the things you can use to stop the bleeding. We didn't ever try that, but that was one of the things that we did seem to know even as kids about this. What we didn't know were probably the more useful pieces of information, and that is you can eat this. I have, as a matter of fact, as an adult, picked it, stewed it, or even just kind of like simmered it, and you can actually physically eat it, not just drink the broth, but physically eat it. I wouldn't say it's delicious, but it is indeed edible. You can also make it into a rope. I've done this part myself. It's a little harder. You actually want to get the dried, fairly dead stuff. It's actually a little more fibrous, and then you can weave it together like a rope. And it was enough that I was able to lift my backpack using that strength of that rope. So pretty good all-round herb. If you're lost somewhere in the woods in a coastal area, this would be a reasonably good one to find. Similarly to nettle as well. These are both herbs you can eat if you find them in the woods. Let's take a look at Usnea now. Here it is. That's a nice picture there. And this is a good robust set. Sometimes you'll see it's just kind of scraggly and thin. Where it likes to grow, it tends to grow quite well. And yeah, sometimes you'll see it, most of this looks dead, but sometimes you'll see it actually take over a tree, usually a dying tree. You'll see it on the bark. More often, you'll see it on the dead limbs. Let's take a look. Yeah, let's try this one here. That's a nice picture there. You can almost see how that looks like a beard hanging in a tree. And that's a pretty accurate picture of there. When it's alive, it has this healthy green. It'll get kind of brown and dry as it starts to die. And if you haven't seen it before, you'll have to go to the coast. That's where you will find it. But once you find it, you'll probably see quite a lot of it. Yeah, sometimes it can even grow on these big tufts, although this looks like it's probably been artificially grown. And that might even be a different species there. Okay. So that is our Usnea barbata, old man's beard. I think we've got one more to look at, and that's going to be cranberry, Vaccinium, or sometimes Vaccinium macrocarpan. This is our cranberry. Bacteriostatic, and mostly now we are saying an anti-adherent, antimicrobial with affinity for the GU. Obviously nutritive if you eat it, quite astringent. And vascular tonic, almost all of the berries, particularly the Vaccinium family, because that's going to include some things like blueberry, are good vascular tonics. Actually, the antioxidants and some of the polyphenols that are in there are quite good for vessel health. Like we talked about, though, astringent, hard to drink, a lot of unsweetened cranberry juice. So where we use this, we've got those anthocyanins. Where we use this is mostly... Yeah, so this is useful to remember here. Only mildly, if at all, antimicrobial directly, but it acts as an anti-adherent and a bacteriostatic, specifically against E. coli. Listeria I've seen as well. Can't say that I've really ever treated a UTI that was primarily listeria-based. Most of what we see, and as far as I know, the large majority of them are E. coli. And we can use it in those cases like we talked about in the building your formula. This is best if taken as a strong juice or capsules at the first sign of infection. So it probably seems to be even a little better as a preventative rather than, or at least an early onset, rather than as a treatment for a fulminant UTI. And I don't remember if we mentioned it in the first part of our UTI section. I know we talked about looking at the health of the immune system and things like that, but cranberry may play a role in toning the bladder wall to prevent, well, obviously adherence, as we've seen here, but to actually prevent that infection kind of growing. One of the thoughts on UTIs is not that it's a recurrent inoculation and a new infection, but rather an infection that has periods of not so much activation and dormancy, but more periods of it's being contained and then periods where the immune system can no longer contain it. And that it's that we actually see as the same infection recurring. And so looking at cranberry possibly as part of the overall strategy to help clear it, hopefully once and for all from the area where the terrain, change the terrain. So many times with infections, as with a lot of other things, but so many times with infections, particularly recurrent infections, we talk about changing the terrain. We talk about this in kidney stones as well. Changing the terrain as a way to actually have that clear and resolve and move to a new state. Let's take a look at cranberry. Here it is. You've certainly seen this before. These are cranberries. That's cranberry on the bush. And that's pretty much all you really need to see about it. You've seen it before, I'm sure. And there's cranberry. Pretty sour. Yeah, that's a nice picture of cranberry there. Pretty sour if you eat them straight. Almost all cranberry juice, if you get the ocean spray stuff, very highly sweetened, really no medicinal benefit because there's so much sugar in there. If you want the benefit of cranberry, you do. Yeah, that's a beautiful picture. You do have to have the unsweetened juice or, like we talked about, the capsules. All right, that concludes our featured herbs for urinary tract infections.